Okay, so welcome to a short video tutorial on how to read a brief. A lot of you will be new to briefs and maybe not understand how it works and the key features that you should be looking for. So let me start. This is what your first page of your brief will look like. At the top it has your course, then down it has the year you're in, which is first year, the title of the assignment or the assignment brief, which is reflection, and then it'll have the units combined within this assignment. We'll go into the depth with each unit and what is required to meet the grades, such as your pass, merit and distinction, later in the video tutorial. At the moment we're just going to highlight each section and what each section stands for. So you'll see here the start date. Start date is when the brief is issued to you, and it is the point where you start working on the brief. Completion date is the date that you hand your work in. Close to the completion date you'll find out the hand-in time. Hand-in times differ depending on how many students we've got handed in at any one point. The more students we have handed in at any one point, the hand-in time will be earlier, giving you longer to get your time in and sign the documentation to say you have completed the assignment. Feedback time is normally 1 college week after submission. So more than often you will hand in before half term, which will then give us a full week and a week when you come back to get the feedback back to you. All in here it says the assessors. The assessors, you've got me, Jodie, and you'll also have Emma. Internal verifier, that is the person who checks your work. Your work will go through standardisation at one point, which means someone outside the course comes and checks that the marks we give you are accurate and we haven't inflated or deflated any grades given to students. This is the most important bit here. This indicates the work you are required to do. Now, each one of these will be different for each brief you get, so please read them in depth. This one illustrates that you will need 10 explorative images. So that means that you will have 10 images. These 10 images could be linked through a series, such as reflection, or these 10 images could be completely separate that relate back to this theme of reflection. At the next point down from there, it says here that an A4 lever arch file or a sketchbook. We suggest in your first few units that you use a sketchbook. And if you struggle with the sketchbook process, then we'll move on to an A4 file for you. The sketchbook process is very, very relevant and very, very useful when it comes to you applying for universities or going on to a job. Employers and universities always ask to see a sketchbook. And if you start using sketchbooks from the very start, right up to the very end of your time with us, you'll have a much greater vast array of sketchbooks to take with you to interviews and to use in the future. And it is always good to look back on your sketchbooks. I've still got all my sketchbooks from my BTEC, and I really find it interesting to look how I've developed and how my work's developed over the years. So that's the first page of a brief. So page 2. Page 2 is more about the depth towards the brief. So it tells you what you're going to be doing, how you're going to be doing it, and what you need to input into your brief. Now it can be quite confusing looking at this page, especially down here. This is very confusing. These bits down here indicate which task, so there's 3 tasks to any one brief, here, and the next task is on the other page. I'll show you that task in a second. Which bits of the assignment you're going to be meeting within that task. So normally a brief has 3 parts to it. It has task 1, task 2 and task 3, which is on the next page. Task 1 is always a research task. It asks you to do research into the art field and also into the photography field. Now, we say on a rule of thumb that you should do 1 photographer and 1 artist for each week of the assignment. So your reflection assignment will be between 6 and 7 weeks. So we say that you should do 6 photographers research and 6 artists research. The next point down is the photo shoot. As part of any unit and as part of the course, we are very strong about practical elements. So in this assignment, we want you to do shoots to represent the research you have created. We also work on the rule of thumb that you should do one shoot per week of the assignment. Again, very easy to remember. Every week you should be doing a shoot, one artist and one photographer. Your research should influence the shoots you do. So each shoot should be influenced by a photographer or an artist. You may do 4 or 5 shoots that's influenced by one photographer that you have researched. These points here also indicate the maths and English you will be covering. Sometimes it's very hard to see the maths and English you will be covering as you're engrossed in the project. But if you reflect upon what you have covered throughout the unit, you'll see you have done a lot of English and a lot of maths as well, such as working out exposure times and working out lighting ratios in the studio maybe. So that's page 2. We'll just have a quick look at the evaluation, which is task 3. So here's task 3 here, the evaluation process. The evaluation process asks you to do lots of little evaluations throughout the project after each shoot you do, which is a very reflective process where you look back and you establish what went right and what went wrong, how you would improve it, and maybe things you might change next time as well. You're also asked to do an overall evaluation at the end of every project. The evaluation should be at least a page and a half of A4. This should reflect back on everything you have covered in the unit. You may talk about things that you would like to improve, things that you would like to do better, things that worked really well. You will all be issued with an evaluation sheet, which is split down into sentences that you need to cover in your evaluation. If you write for each point in that evaluation sheet, you will create a document that will be a side and a half of A4, which will meet the requirement of writing a brief for a unit. So, they're the tasks covered. On this page, you get a quick view of the units that you're going to be covering. You also get a notes section. At the start of each unit, we will issue you with the brief. You will then have a 3-hour session where we work through the brief and highlight everything we need to do and maybe come up with some initial ideas to help us get started on the project. Although the projects are run over 6 weeks, you may think that is a long time. Once you get going, you'll realise that your time runs out very fast. So to hit the ground running in the first day is very important. I strongly suggest that you use this notes section to make notes as you go through the brief. Then you can always reflect back on them notes that you've made. And maybe you might get into week 3 and realise that your first idea isn't going to work. You can then come back to your notes and maybe you might have made 2 or 3 ideas, or maybe even made 8 or 9 ideas, and you can then develop another idea which may be stronger than your first initial idea. As you go through the unit, you'll find this page. This page basically indicates the criteria you need to get a pass grade, a merit grade, and on the next page we have a distinction grade too. Now the terminology with each section of these boxes becomes in greater depth. So for instance, the pass criteria, the terminology in the pass criteria is pretty simple, and that is all delivered within sessions. So if you attend all sessions, which you will all attend all sessions, you will meet the pass criteria. The merit criteria asks you to be a little bit more independent in your studies and develop your own research skills and develop from there. And the distinction criteria asks you to be ultimately independent and be ultimate professional in your development of your work. So the pass criteria is very simple on this one. Identify primary and secondary resources, sources of recording. So that may be looking at imagery, or maybe looking on the internet and using imagery off the internet to be inspired by your own imagery. Record visually is pass criteria too. So that basically means asking you to take photographs. Discuss visual recording in others' work. That is research. That is asking you to look at other people's work and identify exactly what they have done and how they have achieved it. Review own visual research and recording. That basically asks you to break down what you have done and maybe establish or reflect upon the things you have done and how to improve them. You will cover this criteria here in shoot evaluations. Develop visual recording to produce effective outcomes. So that basically says you are going to P4, you are going to look at what you have done and create a shoot evaluation. Then you're going to go from your shoot evaluation and you're going to create a new set of imagery which is linked back to what you have learned from the first initial shoot. And that is how we develop as a photographer. Now, as you get into the merit criteria, it asks you to be more independent and asks you to be more in depth with what you do. So, like I say, we will cover all of the past criteria in the sessions. Depending on how much you do for the past criteria and how independent you are, you will then move on to the merit criteria. We're going to quickly look at the distinction criteria now, so you can have a quick overview of what that is too. So as you can see with the distinction criteria, within the first two words it says independence, asking you to be independent. And then you got innovative, individuality, and evaluate on your own resources. So it asks you to be very much self-driven. And that is what distinction criteria is. It's asking you to become a master of your own work and produce work that is influenced and reflected upon by what you have learned throughout the process. It's asking you to become very self-driven. And that is what makes a good professional in the industry. Being self-driven and being self-innovative in everything you do. And also reflecting on what you've done. In art and design, there is no such thing as a mistake. There is processes that we come to and we can overcome. So, if I make a mistake, that is only going to help my final outcomes become stronger because then I can reshoot and overcome that mistake. And it shows the process I have made to get to that point. Here's an example of another brief. If you would like to pause the video now, you can read through the past criteria here. As you can see, the criteria is very easy and then it develops to get harder and harder to meet. Again, we have some more distinction criteria here. Again, you can pause this and read through it yourself. But it does ask you to be individual. And that is a big point to getting a distinction criteria. It's being individual in all your time and managing your time well and producing work that is off your own back and of your own examples and being self-driven in everything you do. So like I mentioned earlier in the tutorial, the English and Maths is embedded into everything we do, and sometimes you may not notice that you're doing English and Maths until you reflect back on what you've already covered. So your English criteria here asks you to speak and listen. Now you'll be doing a lot of speaking and listening when you're talking to Jodie during tutorials, but you'll be also doing a lot of speaking and listening when you're doing group crits on each other's work, where you'll have to listen to what people are saying and react to what they're saying and produce work to what they're saying. And speaking, giving people audio feedback on what their work and maybe talking to me about your own work. Your reading element, you will have to read through a lot of research and pick out the vital elements that are going to be useful for your project. And then the writing element, you're going to be doing a lot of writing in a sketchbook. And this should be developing as you go. We will give you feedback on your written skills in each unit. So you should read that as well at the end when you get your feedback. Again, each unit has different maths and English skills that you will be learning. It is good to read through these and check that you are developing these skills. So these are always found on the very last pages of your brief. And again, this is our last English and Maths development of skills. Please again read through these, make sure you know what you're doing, and try and develop them in your own practice as well. This will help you become a distinction student, and it will also help you to develop your own English and Maths. We will give you lots of Maths and English development, but it's also good for you to try and develop that yourself.